Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into some really heated rhetoric around U.S.-India trade relations, especially focusing on these new tariffs. And, India's significant trade with Russia, it's been all over the news. Lots of strong opinions, some pretty punchy headlines flying around. So today we're going to try and cut through that noise. We've taken a close look at an expert analysis. It's called India, Oil, and the Truth, Fact-Checking the New U.S. Tariff Talk. It's by Ryan Badia, PhD. Our mission, really, for you, our listener, is to get past those headlines. We want to disentangle the claims, look at the actual legal stuff, the numbers, get to the real story behind these big global trade talks. And I think you'll walk away with a much clearer picture, maybe even some facts that might surprise you. Okay, so let's kick off with a specific claim, one that really sparked this whole debate recently. On September 1st, right, we saw President Donald Trump on Truth Social. He called U.S.-India trade totally one-sided and even said India had offered to cut their tariffs to nothing while backing a huge 50% tariff on Indian goods himself, which, yeah, you can imagine, got tons of coverage in Indian news outlets. And these weren't just words, right? The administration put in place a 25% reciprocal tariff first. Then they added another 25% duty just on Indian stuff starting August 27, 2025. So that brings a lot of imports up to, yeah, a full 50% duty. That's significant.
It is significant. And what's truly fascinating here, looking at the analysis, is that it labels this whole one-sided disaster claim as misleading by omission.
Misleading by omission. Okay, how so?
Well, it's misleading because if you only look at the trade in physical goods, bilateral goods trade, that's just one part of the story. It doesn't capture everything the U.S. actually earns from India.
Ah, okay. So there's more to it than just products crossing borders.
Exactly. The U.S. doesn't just sell, physical stuff. Think about the services trade that's huge. Software, consulting, finance, plus there's intellectual property patents, copyrights, and even sales from U.S. companies operating in India, their affiliates. When you add all that stuff in, the picture looks, well, quite different.
So just to make it super clear for our listener, what's the biggest piece being left out when people only talk about goods trade? And you mentioned a reciprocal tariff. Can you explain what that means? How is it different from other tariffs?
Great questions. Yeah, the biggest omission is definitely that services trade. It's massive and growing. And like I said, intellectual property rights, plus the sales by U.S. subsidiaries inside India. These are huge revenue streams, often much bigger than the goods trade deficit everyone focuses on. Think about, say, an American tech firm developing software for Indian clients.
Right.
Or a U.S. brand selling directly through its own stores or subsidiary in India.
Right.
Those earnings don't pop up in the goods trade balance figures, but they're very real economic benefits flowing back to the U.S.
Okay, that makes sense. And the reciprocal tariffs.
Right, reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah.
The term itself kind of implies a tit-for-tat response, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests the U.S. is imposing tariffs because India supposedly has high tariffs on U.S. goods. It's meant to sound like a balancing act.
To pressure them to lower theirs.
Exactly. A way to push them. But the legal reality here, the U.S. unilaterally doubled duties up to 50% on a lot of Indian goods, effective August 27, 2025. This new tariff package itself is what's really shifting the terms right now. And that claim about India offering zero tariffs, if that really happened, well, there are no published terms, not from Washington, not from New Delhi, which suggests it might have been, hypothetical, or maybe just an early chat, nothing formal. So it really raises this key question for you, the listener. When you hear about trade balances, are you actually getting the full story, the nuanced picture? Or is it just one piece of a much, much bigger economic puzzle?
That definitely helps clarify the tariff side of things. But like you said, there's this other, maybe even more explosive accusation being thrown around, this idea of India laundering Russian oil. Let's dig into that. Peter Navarro, right, former aide, he made headlines between August 31st and September 1st, telling Fox and others that Indian refiners were laundering Russian crude. And he made that really controversial comment about Brahmins profiteering, which, yeah, caused a huge backlash in India, understandably. Then on September 2nd, he criticized PM Modi for, quote, getting in bed with Putin and Xi, and told India to stop buying the oil. But this whole laundering idea, how does the source analysis actually break that down? Does it even fit the definition?
Yeah, that's exactly where the expert analysis focuses, and its verdict on the laundromat claim is pretty blunt. Politically loaded and legally sloppy.
Legal sloppy. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's absolutely true that Indian refiners have been buying discounted Russian crude since 2022. That definitely increased after the invasion of Ukraine. But, and this is the crucial part, you have to understand the context. The G7 price cap coalition, that's the group of 7 major economies, including the U.S., They actually designed specific rules.
Wait, they designed rules for this
We
to
did-
allow it.
Precisely. They designed rules to keep Russian oil flowing onto the global market,
Okay.
while at the same time trying to limit how much money Moscow actually made from it.
Oh, that's a really key distinction. So the G7 created a system for this. How does that actually work, especially for someone maybe not deep into international oil trade? What is this price cap, and what are maritime services you mentioned?
Right, let's break it down. The G7, US, EU, UK, the big players, they had this dilemma, right? Option 1, ban Russian oil completely, but that would likely cause a massive global supply shock. Prices would skyrocket everywhere. Bad news.
Yeah, definitely.
Option 2, find a way to let the oil flow, but cut Russia's profits. They chose option 2, and that's the price cap mechanism. Basically, they said, look, you can still buy Russian oil, but if you want to use our essential maritime services,
Okay, and those are...
things like ships insured by Western companies, financing for the deals from Western banks, or using Western shipping firms, really critical stuff for global trade.
Got it.
If you want to use those services, then the oil must be bought at or below a specific price. That's the cap, currently $60 a barrel for crude. So the system allows these services if the buyers formally declare a test that the oil was bought at or below the cap, and they have to keep detailed records.
Attestations.
Right.
Like formal paperwork.
Exactly. Signed documents proving they followed the rules. And these rules got even tighter on December 20th, 2023. Now they need per voyage attestations, a separate declaration for each individual shipment with all the costs itemized.
Wow, okay, more detailed.
Much more. So this whole framework, it's not laundering, it's the enforcement system the G7 itself created to manage the situation. A real sanctions risk would only happen if a shipment knowingly went above the cap price, or used services like insurance from a G7 country without the proper paperwork.
I see.
And just to quickly touch on that Brahman's comment again, using blanket slurs like that just muddies the water. It mixes up social stereotypes with what's really a technical question of compliance. It rightly drew criticism for being divisive and, frankly, irrelevant to the policy. So, bottom line, when you hear a loaded term like laundering, it's really important to ask, does this accusation actually match the established rules, the international policy, especially when those rules were written by the very countries or groups of countries involved in the discussion?
Okay, so basically we set the rules of the game, and the analysis suggests India is playing by them. That really does reframe things. Could you maybe walk us through a quick example? Like a hypothetical shipment that is compliant, what does a refiner actually do? And maybe what happens if someone doesn't comply?
Yeah, sure, that's a good way to picture it. Okay, imagine an Indian refinery wants to buy a tanker full of Russian crude oil. To be compliant under the G7 price cap, first, they negotiate a price with the Russian seller. It has to be at or below the cap, let's say $60 a barrel.
Right.
Then they arrange shipping and insurance, probably using Western companies because they dominate those markets. Now, the crucial step. Before that ship sails, the Indian refiner has to give an attestation to the shipping company and the insurer. It's basically a signed promise, a document, confirming the purchase price is $60 or less. And now, with the newer rules, that attestation needs itemized costs too, showing how they calculate the price, and they have to keep all these records for potential audits.
Okay, so a clear paper trail is key.
Absolutely. Now, what if someone doesn't comply? Like, say they buy the oil above the cap, maybe $70 a barrel.
Wow.
But they still try to use a Western ship or Western insurance by submitting a false attestation, saying they paid $60.
Ah, okay. Lying on the form.
Exactly. That would be violating sanctions. The company doing it faces risks. But importantly, the Western shipping or insurance company that relied on that false document could face huge penalties if discovered. The whole system relies on that paper trail and making those Western service providers liable for checking the documentation.
That makes it very clear. Thanks. Which then makes you wonder, okay, how does India's trade with Russia actually stack up against other big economies?
It's so easy to get tunnel vision, right? Just focus on one country. We need to zoom out, like our deep dive aims to do.
Yeah.
So how does India compare to, say, China or the EU?
Right, zooming out is essential here. And the raw trade numbers for calendar year 2024, they definitely paint a broader picture. China, for example, their imports from Russia were massive. $129.9 billion. That was part of a record $237 billion two-way trade between them.
Wow, okay, huge numbers.
Huge. Now, the EU 27, even after making big cuts and despite being right next door to Russia, they still imported around $38.8 billion worth of goods.
Still quite a bit, yeah. Then you have India. It's $67.15 billion in imports from Russia. And compare that to the United States, our imports were much, much smaller. somewhere in the range of $3.2 to $3.3 billion. So just looking at those raw totals, you can see why focusing only on India, while maybe downplaying these much larger flows elsewhere, really does misstate the global situation.
But hold on, isn't it also true that even if India's total is less than China's, because India's economy is large, that $67 billion still represents a significant amount of money flowing to Russia, maybe more overall than some smaller countries that might have higher per-person imports? How do we balance those two ways of looking at it?
That's a really sharp point, and it gets right to the core of how we should interpret these numbers. You're absolutely right. The raw totals definitely matter for Russia's overall income. $67 billion is $67 billion. But if you only look at raw totals, it can kind of hide the actual level of dependence or exposure, especially when you compare countries with massively different populations and economies.
Right, like comparing apples and oranges almost.
Exactly. A huge country like India might have a big total number, but proportionally, it might actually be less reliant on Russian goods per person than a smaller country with a lower total value, but where Russian imports make up a much bigger slice of their economy per citizen. So to really get a handle on who's funding Russia the most or who's most economically tied up with them, you really need both views. You need the absolute dollar amount and you need that per person exposure figure.
Okay, that's a critical distinction. So let's look at it through that fairer lens then, accounting for population size. How does the per capita exposure change the narrative?
This is where it gets really interesting. It's one of those moments that can really challenge the easy headlines, you know?
Yeah.
When you calculate the 2024 per capita imports from Russia, dollars per person, the ranking shifts dramatically. Get this. Turkey is way out front at $515 per person.
Wow, $515. That's huge.
Huge. China comes in at $92 per person. The EU 27, even after all their efforts to cut back, still averaged $86 per person. Brazil was $60 per person. And then India, $46 per person.
46. So much lower than Turkey, China, the EU.
Much lower. And interestingly, it's the exact same per capita figure as Japan, $46.
Oh, Japan too. Okay.
Then it drops off quite a bit. The United States is way down at $10 per person. South Africa at $9. Canada maybe $1 or $2 per person. And Australia, barely anything, like 8 cents per person.
Okay, that paints a very different picture.
It really does. On that per person basis, Turkey's reliance just towers over India's. China's per capita exposure is roughly double India's. The EU's is similar to China's, even with their cuts. The U.S. exposure, tiny in comparison. And that context is just crucial when people are arguing about whose purchases are funding Russia or which economies are most deeply entangled. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? Headline numbers often hide as much as they reveal. You need that deeper dive to shift perspective.
It certainly shifts mine. Okay, so tying this back together. If the G7 price cap rules are clear, and the analysis suggests India is operating within them, what was Washington's original goal with this whole system in the first place? Why design it this way? And given this reality we've just discussed, what are the right policy tools to use in this messy global situation? What actually works?
Right. Washington's intention, and the G7's intention more broadly, in designing the price cap was actually quite specific and you could argue quite deliberate. They were trying to juggle three main goals, basically, without completely blowing up global energy markets.
Okay, what were the three?
First, constrain Russia's revenue per unit, make them earn less money for each barrel of oil they sold, cut their profits. Second, keep the oil barrels actually moving, especially to big importers like India and China. This was crucial to stabilize global oil prices and avoid a massive supply shock that would hurt consumers everywhere, including in the West.
Right, avoid spiking gas prices at home.
Exactly. And third, shift the main burden of enforcing the cap onto those Western maritime service industries we talked about, the shippers, the insurers, the financiers. Make them responsible for collecting the paperwork, the attestations. The idea was to channel Russian oil through these transparent, declared, below-cap deals precisely to avoid the chaos of a full supply cutoff.
So it was a calculated move to manage a difficult situation.
Precisely. So when Indian refiners buy below the cap, using compliant Western services and providing the right documents, they are essentially operating inside the system that the U.S. and its partners specifically chose and designed. Calling that laundering just fundamentally misunderstands or misrepresents the policy. It confuses following the rules with breaking them. And India talking about strategic autonomy, wanting to balance its energy sources based on cost, security, politics, that's not new. That's been their approach for decades.
So they've always shopped around for the best deal, essentially.
Pretty much. And yes, their imports from Russia went up in 2024, that's clear. But it's also true that documented compliance actions with the price cap globally also increased as the G7 tightened enforcement. More paperwork, more checks.
That's a really critical point. Okay, so if India is complying with the G7's own framework, why these new 50% tariffs on other completely unrelated Indian goods? Doesn't that risk kind of undermining the very framework we created if we punish compliance? And when you say better, faster enforcement of the price cap is the right tool, what does that actually look like on the ground? How do you do that?
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head. It highlights why tariffs, like this new 50% one on various Indian goods, are often described as a blunt instrument. They punish Indian exports that have nothing to do with oil, textiles, gems, maybe some manufactured parts, but they do very little, if anything, about the oil flows themselves.
Because oil is governed by the separate price cap rules, not tariffs.
Correct. Those oil flows are handled by the sanctions and price cap regime, not the general customs tariff schedules. And yes, there's absolutely a risk of undermining the framework. Think about it. If countries like India are meticulously following the price cap rules for oil, but then they get hit with unrelated tariffs on their other exports anyway, what's the incentive to keep using the G7 system?
Right, they might look elsewhere.
It might be pushed towards using non-Western shipping or insurance for their oil trades, which, ironically, could make it harder for the G7 to track shipments and enforce the price cap effectively in the future. It could backfire. So the source analysis really drives this point home. For effective policy, you need the right tool for the job. If the goal is genuinely fewer Russian barrels ending up in India, the correct lever isn't broad tariffs on Indian T-shirts. It's stronger enforcement of the existing price cap. It's using secondary sanctions specifically targeting shipments or facilitators that are proven to be non-compliant ships, turning off transponders, companies filing fake documents, banks enabling illicit payments.
So surgical strikes, not a scattergun approach.
Exactly. Track the rogue vessels, dig into the paperwork, find the false attestations, and penalize those specific bad actors who are breaking the rules. And if the broader goal is simply to reduce the Kremlin's income from energy without causing a global energy crisis, again, the answer is better, faster enforcement of the price cap we already have. Not resorting to caricatures of India's role or using these broad-brush tariffs that mostly miss the actual target, which is the oil revenue. Better, faster enforcement means things like more robust intelligence sharing between G7 nations, more resources for investigating potential evasion networks, and taking swift, targeted action against those caught facilitating above-cap sales. The numbers we discussed, and crucially the G7's own rules, they really bear that out.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really unpacked a lot. The nuance behind those trade figures, how the G7 oil price cap actually works, and just how vital context is when we hear these big claims about global trade. So what does this all mean for you, our listener?
Well, I think it means understanding these details, the mechanics behind the headlines, really helps us navigate this world. There's just full of information and, yeah, some very strong opinions. It's about looking beyond the easy sound bites.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, I think it strongly suggests that effective policymaking really hinges on using precise tools. Tools that are actually aligned with your stated goals. Rather than relying on broad rhetoric or maybe picking a policy tool like tariffs here that isn't really designed for the specific problem, like oil flows under a price cap, the unintended consequences of misaligned policies, they can be really significant. They can end up hurting areas far removed from the original issue and sometimes even undermine the very goals you were trying to achieve in the first place. That's a powerful point. So, a final thought for everyone listening. As you hear more about international trade, about geopolitical tensions, especially when strong accusations get thrown around, maybe pause and consider which claims are actually backed up by the rules on the ground, by the global data, and which might be missing that crucial context or maybe painting with too broad a brush. And it makes you wonder what other areas of global policy where maybe accusations fly just as freely could really benefit from a similar deep dive. A close look at the numbers and the original intent behind the policies themselves. Something to think about.